Hi guys, Claudia Boleyn here, and this is the second video in my Umbrella Academy character analysis series. Today I'm talking about my joint favourite character, the criminally underrated Diego Hargreeves. Everyone likes Diego, but he should be loved. He is a top tier sibling, and in this video I will explain why. As usual, this is a deep dive into his character and psychology. If you've seen the first video in my series all about Luther, you'll know what to expect. If not, the link to that is in the description box. I also made a video ages ago after the first series about how the Umbrella Academy siblings demonstrate different reactions to childhood abuse and how that manifests in their adult lives. The link to that is also in the description box. So how to describe Diego? He's stubborn, obstinate, intense, rebellious, impulsive, obsessive, reckless, defiant, fiercely independent, distrustful of authority, deeply insecure, and highly emotionally intelligent. That is just a list of adjectives, I know. So I'm going to delve into these traits throughout the video and unpack them a bit. Assuming you've seen both seasons and are familiar with Diego's story, I'm going to jump right in with the hell on earth Diego finds himself dropped into at the beginning of the second season. So something that Luther, Diego, Alison and Five have in common is that they're crash-landed into nightmare scenarios, unlike Klaus and Vanya, who arguably have a better time than they did before. So just as we see Luther faced with his worst nightmare, which is rejection by his father, we see Diego faced with his own worst nightmare, powerlessness and a loss of control. I'd say Diego's two greatest fears as a character, aside from losing those he loves, are powerlessness and being second best. Like Luther's fears, they were created by their father. Being second best is pretty self-explanatory, although I'll talk more about it later, but being literally named number 2 and constantly having to fight, unsuccessfully, to outshine Luther and impress their father created lasting issues for him. But in terms of powerlessness, we can assume, and it's implied, that Diego fought his whole childhood and teen years for some sense of control in the unpredictable and adult world he and his siblings were expected to grow up within. In this hellish scenario, he became the rebel of the group, and because of this, he was made the scapegoat in the family system. For those who don't recognise that term or what it means within a dysfunctional or abusive family setup, the scapegoat is the child that draws the fire of the parent in the dysfunctional or abusive family. And this is often because they are the most defiant, they may stand up for themselves or others, or it could simply be that they draw the negative projections of the parent, so they could represent parts of the parent doesn't wish to acknowledge. In Reginald's case, Diego is a reflection of his cruelty to the children, because he's the one kid that turns on and blames their father. Why else might Diego have been chosen as the scapegoat by Reginald? In the comics, it's made pretty clear that Reginald personally disliked his second son. He refers to him as obstinate, and Diego's anger issues in the show and the comics clearly come from this open dislike from his father. In the first script for the Umbrella Academy, there's a scene of young Diego in a water tank, sticking his middle finger up in Reginald's direction as he's forced to test his powers. If you don't read the comics, Diego's other power, not yet utilised by the show, is his ability to hold his breath for long amounts of time. A side note here, but it's interesting to note that both of Diego's powers involve a sense of repressed anger, of literally holding his breath, holding all the tension, and then lashing out sharply with projectiles like knives. Several reasons for Diego's position as scapegoat in the family system struck me. It seems like a mixture of his natural stubbornness, his closeness to his mother, and his high emotional intelligence and empathy, which places him in this role. Because unlike Luther, who will be mistreated, believe it's his fault, apologise and try to improve, Diego's personality responds with righteous anger. He notices the injustice and holds a grudge, which therefore threatens Reginald's authority. In terms of personalities, Reginald has quickly assessed the siblings and seen that the one most likely to cause trouble is Diego. His powers might not be overly threatening, but his moral code and defiance certainly are. There's a strength in Diego that Reginald needed to try and grind down so he could bring him to heel. But as we know, Reginald found this a much harder task than it was for any of the other kids. Here is this one little boy or teenager that holds the hurt and the anger, lets it fester inside him, understands the injustice, and openly displays not only opposition, but also resentment. Reginald had to put Diego in his place and keep him down, because otherwise we're looking at a mutiny. Hence why Reginald chooses Luther as his number 1, and why he he dangles that position tantalizingly in front of Diego in an attempt to draw his focus and determination towards supplanting his brother instead of directing it at his father. And in some ways, Reginald is a clever manipulator here, because in creating conflict between 1 and 2, Diego ends up with misplaced hatred and anger at Luther. Luther regards Diego as a threat and someone trying to take his place, and ultimately the boys don't unite and topple their father's control, which is in both of their interests. You can see how the other kids have also been conditioned to view Diego as the rebel of the group, and how this stops them from joining with him in a serious way. At Ben's funeral, Alison finds it very easy to snap at him, like this is a familiar family system at this point, and they're used to him being unable to hold back his anger, and they're dismissive of him for it, rather than looking at the cause. So Diego has the reputation of being the bad, difficult child again, the one upsetting the family dynamic, rather than him being made angry by that toxic dynamic. When Diego throws the conch shell, Alison says that's classic, and the idea is that it's classic Diego behaviour. But what we see with Diego in a lot of scenes is that Diego is judged for his reaction, but not validated in the context leading up to that. He's been trained into these sudden outbursts at injustice and in anger, which can then be explained away by the others as Diego just being disruptive and uncontrollable. You see this in the dynamics of oppression, by the way, with oppressed groups being made to feel inferior, having to internalise the injustice, this bubbling up for a long time without any support. Then when the explosion suddenly happens, they're able to be discounted as radicals, or too angry, or too reactive. It's a clever manipulation technique we see in society too, and how the privileged group can be in the wrong, present themselves as blameless protectors of the status quo, versus these terrible, angry disruptors who act in such an uncivilized manner. But if you hold someone down for long enough and fill them with that much resentment because of injustice, you can't then expect them to react calmly at all times. Diego's rightful anger and message is dismissed because they think he's a troublemaker. And that's very relevant to the times we're living in right now. Looking at how Reginald controlled Diego, or tried to, I've been thinking a lot about Diego's close relationship with his mother. It's hard to tell whether Reginald disapproved of this or whether he used it for his own ends. It all comes down to the question from season 1, of whether Grace was a part of Reginald herself, or if she was her own person. When she helps Diego with his stammer when the kids get ready for a mission, Reginald appears outside, his expression unreadable. Is he displeased with Grace for giving Diego this extra support, love, and confidence in himself? Or is this just another way of controlling his resentful son? After all, Diego being so connected to Grace keeps him as part of the family. He doesn't want to leave because he doesn't want to leave her. It feels like the carrot and the stick scenario, like good cop, bad cop. Grace gives Diego enough love and support that he stays, that he likes being with her and is desperate to be in her presence. Love for his mother stops Diego from attempting a complete mutiny. Now we've got into this scapegoat role and how the others were manipulated into dismissing Diego's valid anger, how Diego had this festering resentment and rage inside him that he had nowhere to direct and so swallowed, having to follow his father's orders until he could leave home, we can see why powerlessness, invalidation and loss of control is such a nightmare for Diego. And what better setting to serve as a metaphor for Diego's life and situation than a mental institution in the 60s, where the patients are essentially imprisoned, dehumanised, have their individuality stripped from them, are treated like children, are hurt by people in authority, those they have to show deference to and who are meant to protect them, and every last bit of control is taken from them. Diego's adult identity is built around his individuality and his lone wolf status, him being an anti-authority good guy that plays by his own rules. He's thrown out of the police academy before we meet him in season 1 because it requires complete obedience, and Diego resists any and all attempts at taking away his freedom and ability to object to something he thinks is wrong. He wants desperately to do good, to prove he can be a hero, but knows that taking orders unquestioningly is wrong, so he never becomes a police officer, and instead gets a job mopping floors and boxing by day, secretly crime fighting by night. In season 2, Diego helpfully expresses this mindset to us when Lila kidnaps him and brings him to the commission. He says, "I don't belong to anyone." When he's asked where his loyalties ultimately lie, he answers, "with me." And when Elliot asks Diego, Lila and Five if they're enemies of the people, we have a really funny example of Diego's worldview. He says, "That's such an open-ended question if you think about it." And Five, who has broken away from life as an assassin at this point, agrees that it depends on the people. Five and Diego are interesting comparisons in this regard, because although they both have pretty independent worldviews, Five sits on the big picture side of morality, and Diego sits on the individual first side. I'll talk more about this in my Five video, but to simplify, we have a split between the siblings that would put an individual life first because of their emotional connection to a situation, and the siblings that detach, try to think more logically, and would go for saving the largest amount of people. Neither mindset is wrong, but it's an interesting split in the group, because based on season 1, and bear in mind this changes in season 2, we have Diego, Klaus, Vanya and Alison, who will put an individual life first, and then we have Luther, Five and Ben, who would more likely act based on numbers and the greatest good they could achieve. Anyway, that was a huge but sort of relevant digression. Back to Diego in season 2. So him being in the mental institution puts Diego back into the state he was in as a child. What we get to see this time is Diego's coping mechanism and how he survived his childhood. In the face of invalidation and abuse by an unjust authority, Diego doesn't crumble. Instead, he rages, turns it inwards, and uses that fury as a motivator in something that becomes obsessive. So how Diego coped with his childhood was to become angry, insular, determined, and obstinate, something that definitely damaged him as an adult, but served him back at the academy and stopped him from becoming a loyal soldier like Luther, or from going off the deep end like Klaus. Diego is impulsive, but he can be patient too, as long as he's being active, not passive, and he has some sort of plan. Diego's obstinance is a blessing and a curse, because he will cling to his right to exist on his own terms no matter what he's facing. But he can also get unhealthily obsessed with a goal, as we see with him needing to save JFK. In the institution, Diego is playing the long game of his childhood again, with the ultimate aim of freeing himself. He's so determined and focused that his level of intensity can almost read as unbalanced. He's biding his time, even after 75 days of captivity. There's no sense of him having given up. Diego knows he's getting out of there, and he's convinced he's going to save the president. In the face of powerlessness, Diego is scrabbling for all the power he can claw back. He's shaving down the bars in his room, pretending to change his mindset in group. If he hadn't escaped, I'm certain Diego would have continued his attempts, potentially for years. He's not as big or strong as Luther, but he's got the ability to keep picking himself back up. Of all the siblings, Diego's the one you can knock down over and over and not manage to keep him down. You can see that in Diego and Luther's fight scene in Season 1, Episode 1, where Luther has all the strength and should logically win, but Diego is almost crazed with determination. He waits and waits for a moment of weakness to strike. You can imagine them training as kids, Luther easily overpowering Diego, but Diego working on agility, speed, distractions, anything to match him. Diego does not accept defeat. He's always trying to think around obstacles. The sequence with Diego in a straitjacket to the song Crazy is one of my favourite Diego moments of the show. It's the perfect metaphor, because Diego is drugged, his arms buckled down, with nothing there in the room with him, but he fights to his feet, dislocates his own shoulder to escape his bonds, gets the cell open and staggers out, barely able to put one foot in front of the other. This intensity to his personality is such a strength. He has this inner drive which none of the other siblings can match. It's also notable that yet again he's telling an uncomfortable truth and being told he's mad and disruptive for it, because he knows JFK is getting assassinated, just like he knew their father was an asshole, but nobody believes him or wants to help him act. That doesn't stop a character like Diego though. Everyone else in the world could tell him he's insane, but if he thinks he's right, there is no stopping him. Reginald referred to him as an insolent brat. So like a lot of kids in that sort of situation, he's spiraled. If you tell a kid they're the problem for long enough, it's going to mess with their head and their relationships in later life. David Castaneda said he researched kids in foster homes for the role, and I think that really comes across, because there's this loneliness, this fierce independence, and this stubborn determination to prove the world wrong about him. Which leads us to Diego's obsessive personality. We can most clearly see it in Season 2 because it's commented on by other characters, but he's had this the whole time we've known him. Diego's actually one of the most relatable characters here in my view, because think about it. The siblings have just avoided the apocalypse and time travelled for the first time. They're all alone, and Diego personally has lost his mother, Eudora, and Pogo in the space of a few days. So although Diego has the coolest superhero entrance to the 60s, his mind isn't able to cope with it all. And why would it? The whole whole thing is insane. He reverts immediately to his hero complex, and his first action is stopping a mugger from robbing a woman, because when Diego feels small and afraid, he saves people to prove to himself that he has worth. Then he sees a television in the shop window showing President Kennedy, and the rest is history. There are so many memes about Diego's crush on JFK, and I'm just putting it out there, Diego passes the bisexual vibe check with flying colours. But Diego's essentially a Doctor Who companion at this point, and not one of the boring ones. He's experienced time travel, is in a whole new environment, and in response, he thinks about what he can do to fix a historic injustice. JFK is still alive. Diego immediately fixates on him because his image is right there, and so he decides he's using his new situation to be a hero yet again. So in a move that is perhaps not smart, but ultimately very good, Diego goes after Lee Harvey Oswald. To watch him, not hurt him, he tells Lila he won't kill someone before they've committed a crime, and is arrested for loitering and having multiple knives. Although there is a racial element to Diego's story too, because the newspaper article says the police were called on him because he was a loitering Hispanic man. I like that they have Diego mentioning his identity more in this season, being confused at being referred to as Cuban, for example. David Castaneda is Mexican-American, so I'm assuming Diego is too. When Five goes to see Diego in the institution, Diego has had time to grow his plans. After he saves JFK, he tells Five he's going to kill Hitler. A great bit of info on this is that the original line was that Diego was going to shoot Hitler, but David Castaneda changed it to slitting his throat with a butter knife, because Diego doesn't like guns. It makes sense, because Diego is obsessed with having a fair fight and giving out justice, like Batman is. So to him, I assume guns are cowardly and require no skill. I mean, think about how upset Diego is that his father cheap shots him this series. The reason I think Diego is the sort of character that would make either an excellent or a terrible Doctor Who companion is that he's the sort of personality that wants to change things, rules be damned. That means doing what he feels is right above all else. Only he's not sensible and grounded in this like Alison, who gets behind a social issue and works hard and slowly on making change. Diego is impulsive and obsessive, and so needs a simple aim. Just like when he lived his life catching criminals, getting those nightly hits of self-esteem from putting them away. It honestly seems like a relief for Five that Diego's been locked up, because otherwise he'd probably have been out there changing time. Which brings me to something Reginald says to Diego when the siblings meet with him in episode 6. This was the most painful scene of the entire show for me, by the way, and that means season 1 and 2. Diego is convinced that he's finally cracked it, that he's solved the JFK conspiracy, only Reginald manages to turn him back into his child self by humiliating him and sending him sinking back into his seat with a stammer. Reginald says, "You fancy yourself a do-gooder, the last good man who will save us from our descent into corruption and conspiracy. This is a fantastic delusion. The sad reality is that you're a desperate man, tragically unaware of his own insignificance, desperately clinging to his own ineffectual reasoning. More succinctly, a man in over his head." But what I did love here was that even though Diego is stammering and in tears, he still manages to force the words "you're wrong" out, which is very him. Reginald is sort of right though, not about Diego's insignificance, but he is a desperate man clinging to conspiracies because the nuance of reality is too much for him. Which brings me to Diego, the black and white thinker. So although Diego is one of the most mature in terms of actually leaving the academy and getting a job, Diego is still a childlike thinker. Like Luther, he sees the world in black and white, with good versus evil. The interesting difference between them is that Luther believes in ultimate goodness and is an optimist, while Diego is more cynical and believes in ultimate corruption that must be fought. This is one of the reasons Luther and Diego make such a brilliant duo in season 2, especially in the scene after Elliot's death. Diego immediately assumes the feds have killed him in some sort of conspiracy. Luther then declares that it's the work of a psychopath because the feds would never be so dishonourable, which actually they are, as we see with their treatment of Vanya. One's too far one way, incredibly gullible and susceptible to abuses by authority figures, and the other's so aware of the corruption of authority that his mind is filled with conspiracies and thoughts of sinister cabals. Diego gets nearer to the truth, but won't look at evidence because he's so incredibly stubborn and distrusting of anything he hasn't seen or discovered himself. Diego has developed this black and white way of thinking in order to cope with his life. When Luther tells him the whole group are messed up when it comes to Reginald, Diego tells him, "Oh, I'm not. He's an asshole. I'm awesome." That's very simple. And Diego is right here, but it also shows us that Diego struggles with the nuances of situations. There are good guys and there are bad guys. Everything has an ultimate reason behind it. Every crime can be solved. And this is another way of Diego trying to find some control in his life, which is doomed to failure, because sometimes in life, there just aren't answers. David Castaneda spoke about Diego's mindset in season 2, and he talks about Diego wanting to try and understand his father, to figure it all out. And I think that's because to a personality like Diego, the idea that there was no ultimate plan behind it, no greater good or even a greater evil, is terrifying for him. He can't accept that they went through so much trauma for nothing. He can't accept his own powerlessness. The Doctor in the first episode of season 2 is absolutely correct about Diego when he explains how he defines himself in opposition to his father. This is where Diego's good and bad mindset becomes unhealthy. Diego should be able to step away from his father now. Instead, we still have him almost competing with his father, trying to prove him wrong, trying to prove himself, stuck in this eternal fight against him, where one side doesn't even care. This is partly why I think Diego goes in on Luther so much in season 1, by the way, because deep down he knows he doesn't matter enough to Reginald to get the reaction he craves, but he does know that he matters to Luther, so it's his substitute. Luther is upset by Diego's actions and his attitude clearly hurts him, but Reginald regarded Diego as little more than an annoyance. What's the point of lashing out at someone who doesn't even see you as a person? Diego makes a Star Wars reference with himself in the role of Luke Skywalker versus Darth Vader, because it is that simplistic to Diego. It's a world of heroes and villains. When Vanya is being tortured by the FBI and Klaus doesn't want to step up, Diego is really angry at him, because in his world you pick a side. You're good or bad. Think about how similar to Luther Diego is here. You have Luther defining himself based on what Reginald wanted him to be, even choosing hobbies to impress Reginald. Then you have Diego defining himself as the total opposite to his dad, or at least trying to be. Not that he succeeds in this. Diego thinks he's being so very different, but he's still trying to prove himself to Reginald and show that he can be a hero, in spite of what his father thought. David Castaneda phrases this brilliantly. He says, "I'm trying to prove you wrong. You said that I was worthless and I was number 2, but I can do things on my own." But even with Diego as such a black and white thinker, we also have the unlikely accompanying quality of him being able to forgive. Diego needs you to prove you've changed in order to accept your apology, but he will forgive you. Having lived a hellish childhood and never once getting the validation of an apology, or even his father accepting wrongdoing, apologies are very important to Diego. Vanya almost killed him in season 1 and caused the death of Grace, but she apologises, and he admits that helps, then immediately drops his beef with her. He's not used to someone putting their hands up like that when they mistreat him. And this is interesting because Diego is also the character most able to hold a grudge. Some people think of Diego as a cruel character because he can be cynical and sharp, but Diego has high emotional intelligence, even though he can't seem to use it to understand himself. In my last video, I spoke about Diego's ability to empathise with the underdog and to stand up for those he reads as vulnerable. Because he felt like the underdog his whole life, like the disappointment, you can see that Diego is fiercely protective of other such outsiders. The only exception to this is Vanya, but that is because Diego feels that Vanya has committed a personal betrayal. Number 1 was her publishing a book exposing their childhood, and therefore turning Diego into a victim in the public eye, rather than this impressive stone-cold Batman figure, and the second is her choosing to remain loyal to their father, when Diego did not. Diego and Vanya have a band in the comics, and in the show I think this is also canon, because you can see a flyer for one of their gigs in one of the scenes, and David Castaneda talks about how prior to Diego leaving, he was in a band with Klaus and Vanya. Diego can put up with a lot of things, but betrayal is especially hard for him to handle. The other reason why young Diego may not have used his empathy to connect with Vanya is that he doesn't read her as such an underdog. We do, as viewers, but to Diego, who is forced out on horrible missions, made to train, to get a tattoo when he's scared of needles, to experience the loss of a sibling, she probably came across as having an easy deal compared to the rest of them. It seems like he resented her for being the only one free of it. I think it takes an underdog to identify other underdogs, and I use Luther and Diego as great examples here. They are both kind at heart. They both want to be heroes and to help other people. Luther is not very emotionally intelligent though, therefore he needs a vulnerable person to ask him for help to understand that he's needed. But Diego is much smarter here, because he can identify the vulnerable people that don't act vulnerable. Let's look at Klaus. Klaus does not act like he's vulnerable. Klaus is difficult and outrageous and funny and floats through life. This is a great example because Diego can read his siblings better than any of the others. Being so emotionally attuned and being so aware of even the slightest shifts in the emotions of a room, something common for kids that come from toxic backgrounds, Klaus is the perfect person for Diego to save. A victim who admits they are a victim disturbs Diego because he denies his own victimhood, but a victim who insists they are fine is exactly the sort of person Diego will give his protection and support to. Grace never complains. She always has a smile on her face, but Diego sees how her life is wearing her down. He thinks more deeply about this than the others because he's so emotionally intelligent. He would deny it, but he is exceptionally compassionate and brilliant at putting himself in other people's shoes. He's even able to do this with Luther, his main competition, ending up with this confused mess of insults, but also pity and an awareness that Luther is one of the biggest victims of them all. Now, this connection to the underdog is relevant to Diego's newest relationship, and that is his relationship with Lila. The love interests for the siblings in the show are so fascinating to me because in them we can see what each sibling truly values, what sort of people they are drawn to. But no other relationship in the show does this quite as well as with Diego and Lila, in my opinion. Because Lila is a mixture of three of the most important people in Diego's life: Grace, Klaus, and Luther. So that's his adored mother, the brother he's closest to, and the brother he both idolises and resents. So the Grace and Lila connection. We all know how close Diego is to his mother, but more than that, he was the only sibling who really seemed to see her as a person in her own right. He was determined that she had evolved beyond what Reginald made her. He couldn't stand for her to be put down coldly, like some malfunctioning machine after a sibling vote, and so he quietly took the decision to shut her down himself, before the others could do it. In season 1, he talks about how horribly she was treated by their father, how she has a right to be angry, how she can go wherever she wants now Reginald is dead. The siblings know Grace is just a robot or an android, and she's been created in that classic 50s housewife role too, caring for the kids, cooking and cleaning, subservient to Reginald. But Diego sees her as more than this. Grace is an overlooked character, by society and by the family. The outside world doesn't know that she exists, we assume, and inside the house she's a housekeeper. The others assume she doesn't have feelings, and they never ask for her opinions or give her a voice. So how does this link to Lila? Well, think about the Lila Diego meets before he figures out her true identity. Lila is a woman with mental illness in the 60s. She's been put in an institution, treated like a child, and been made voiceless. To society, Lila doesn't matter. She's an overlooked, mistreated young woman of colour. Now, Diego immediately recognises her worth. Lila is a person to him. The rest of the world in the 60s would view the patients as insane and therefore useless, but Diego's clearly started to like Lila already in the asylum. So in Lila, there is Grace. It's Diego's opportunity to save his mother, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her who is overlooked because she's different, kept captive, and treated like she isn't a full person. Secondly, we have the Klaus and Lila connection. This is the biggest and most obvious link to me. Lila and Klaus are startlingly similar. We can see from season 1 how well Diego and Klaus get on, how even though Diego complains, he agrees to drive Klaus around and puts up with his weirdness. There's a real sense of closeness between these brothers in particular, and this again comes from Klaus reading as vulnerable to Diego. Klaus is exactly the sort of underdog Diego likes, because Klaus is also absolutely unique and strange. Diego really values people who don't conform and who live lives on their own terms, and Klaus is the epitome of this. Although Diego disapproves of the drug taking, there's a clear respect for the fact that Klaus doesn't give a shit about what people think of him. Diego is fiercely individual, and this is the greatest link between Diego and Klaus. There's a sense that they probably teamed up a lot over the years, with Klaus yelling for Diego to hit Luther at Reginald's funeral, and Klaus agreeing with Diego when they have the conversation about Grace. A lot of it is unspoken too, but you definitely feel that these are siblings with a strong bond. Look at their body language. Diego was most likely a protector of Klaus during their childhood because he will protect an underdog, and we can see how badly Klaus was treated by their father, left crying in the mausoleum and then turning into an addict to cope. You often see Klaus and Diego interacting subtly in scenes, which is a really nice touch from the actors. In the season 2 reuniting of the siblings scene, it's Klaus Diego is especially pleased to see, and they're pretty tactile considering Diego is usually playing the intense Batman role. So we have two aspects of Lila that Diego is able to relate to through his relationship with Klaus. You have him dealing well and easily with her unconventional, quirky personality, how outrageous and off the wall she is. She's also funny like Klaus and will say whatever she's thinking. Some of her lines really could be written for Klaus. But we also have her more fragile side. There's the scene this season where Diego goes to check on Lila and finds her curled up in the photograph room. She's huddled in a corner and seems to be experiencing mental health issues, which we assume are probably acted. Diego is soft and reassuring with her. He's protective and understands how to put her at ease. They also have a similar, "Oh my god, go away, I work alone. Wait, where are you going? I love you, please be safe" dynamic from Diego's end. So in Lila, Diego is also saving Klaus. He couldn't save Klaus from his demons when they were kids, but he thinks maybe he can help Lila with hers. But of course, Lila is not the person Diego thinks she is. Not entirely, anyway. The most interesting move from Season 2 with regard to Diego's growth is to have him love and value somebody that actually most resembles his childhood enemy and competition, Luther. In Season 1, we see Diego resenting Luther, being in constant competition with him, being really quite spiteful about Luther's loyalty to their father, bringing up the ways in which Reginald hurt him. What we know about Lila, before Diego finds out, is that Lila is actually very similar to Luther. Lila wholeheartedly believes in her mother. She's a loyal soldier to her, obediently doing her bidding even at 30 years old. She also shares a trait that Diego can't stand in Luther, that Lila is oblivious to her own mistreatment and defends the handler. I don't think it's any coincidence that in this series, we see Diego and Luther really starting to bond. People call them two halves of a whole idiot, which is probably accurate. These two fairly new relationships, because Luther and Diego seem to reunite on healthier and more loving terms this season, tell us so much about Diego. So Diego's Series 2 arc is essentially him going from a lone wolf to a character that actively seeks the companionship of others. This season, Diego doesn't hide the fact that he loves being with his siblings. He endearingly names them Team Zero, wanting to throw the number system that made him feel so insecure over the years out. This is the same Diego that last season worked alone and went about brooding and being all gritty. Now Diego loves being part of a group, especially as there's no leader. He's reaching for this as early as episode 1, when after telling Five about his plan to save the president, he asks if he wants in, like some generous big sibling. Diego's closeness to Luther this season is brilliant. I love little touches like him following Luther out of Morty's when Five suggests meeting with their father. At first it seems like he's done it to be an annoying little brother, but he's really there because he respects Luther's new independence from their father and wants to connect with him. In the day before they meet Reginald, we see Luther and Diego having dinner together, on some sort of duo detective mission. He even opens up to Luther and Vanya about liking Lila. This is a character with a lot of love to give, and when he stops being stubborn, it's the sibling that most loves being part of a team. And I think Diego has always wanted this closeness with Luther. In Season 1, Diego's hatred for his father and Luther's obedience to him gets in the way, but you can still see elements of Diego reaching out to Luther. After Luther gets drunk and Five, Klaus and Diego find him in a bar, Diego sends Five and Klaus off out of the way so he can talk to his big brother one-on-one. Even in their first scene, Diego goes up to Reginald's room where Luther is. He can't resist making the usual digs at Luther's expense, but there's still a sense of wanting to be there with him, deliberately winding him up, perhaps because it's comforting. We also have the scene where Diego and Luther look for Five in the library, and Diego tries to push Luther into thinking about why he didn't leave, and how he's missed out in life. Some of the things he says in Season 1 make it seem like he hates Luther, but if you read what's underneath, you can tell he really loves him. There's this constant desire to rescue him from the brainwashing underneath the spite. Diego also looks up to Luther, and this is subtle. I think it probably comes from their childhood, but he does try to emulate his brother. After Luther tells Diego that leaders make difficult choices, they lead, it doesn't seem that Diego has paid any attention, but later on when he's with Five and Allison, Diego recites that same quote almost word for word as he tries to lead Five and Allison in the way he's seen Luther do it. So by the time the Season 2 finale happens and Lila is revealed to be in a similar situation to Luther from Series 1, we have Diego having the new strength and ability to reach out to her, not to be angry at her for the brainwashing, but to offer to be her family. He's achieved this with Luther and knows that with Lila too, it isn't her fault. Even when the others decide she's too dangerous and they have to take her on again, Diego stops them. He's determined not to push her away. He's learned to swallow his pride and put his emotions out there. It's not embarrassing for him to say that he loves Lila or that he loves his family. I mean, after all that time Diego spent in his life resenting Luther, hating him, loving him, pitying him, winding him up, he ends up meeting the love of his life, who has almost the exact same story and issues. So in saving Lila, Diego is saving his big brother Luther. Now, an aspect of Diego I can't ignore in this video is Diego's relationship with being a man. This is something that Diego really struggles with and seems really insecure about. Diego's relationship with being a man is something subtle in the show, starting from our first scene of him as a kid, when he says, "Guns are for sissies, real men throw knives." The idea of being a real man is especially important for Diego, because he isn't sure what it means. The man he was supposed to respect and emulate in life was Reginald, but he mistreated the children. The style of his upbringing was very much teaching him to put empathy aside for the greater good, which provided special problems for the most emotionally intelligent boy in the group. So Diego ends up emulating fictional heroes or ideals and not real men. So he's modelled on Batman and he brings Luke Skywalker up to his therapist. He's this confusing mixture of wanting to show how masculine he is, how independent, how strong, how resilient, to a pretty extreme degree, but also hating those more traditional aspects of toxic masculinity, like abuses of power, overlooking women, and ignoring empathy. When he dances with Lila, he feels uncomfortable about switching roles, not because he's sexist, because Diego is pretty fair-minded and values people based on who they are, regardless of anything else, but because he feels insecure about his masculinity. You even see it in front of his siblings when he puts on an act, trying to come across like some tough gangster type with all sorts of things going on secretly. In season 1, when they need the file on Harold Jenkins, Five could just blink into the police station and get it, but Diego wants to go himself, just to prove how tough and capable he is. Put simply, Reginald has messed Diego right up. And this is partly why I think Diego seems to resonate so strongly with LGBT viewers, those who struggle with gender expression or not fitting the traditional gender roles. And that's not even getting into his righteous anger at the abuses of society and his stubborn determination to be himself even when he's told that's wrong. Basically, Diego Hargreeves is the bisexual legend we all deserve, so come on Umbrella Academy, make it canon. But although Diego can be read in this way, what we also see beneath it all is this preoccupation with being a grown man, with being a grown-up. Diego will do anything to distance himself from the person he was when he was a child. He wants the world to know he's an adult, that he makes his own decisions. But Diego isn't quite sure how to be a grown-up. In season 1, he's going through the motions with somewhere to live, a job, just getting by. But he's living this strange existence, a childlike dream of crime fighting by night. Eudora calls him out on this, and the reason they never worked seems to be that Diego is still a child inside. Diego tells his therapist that he's a grown-ass man, and says to Luther and Vanya that they're grown-ass men and women. It's like he's reassuring himself of this. When he fights with Reginald and ends up getting stabbed, Diego insists to Lila that if they'd fought man to man instead of Reginald cheap-shotting him, Reginald would have lost. The song I'm a Man plays over the fight sequence, so you can't get any more literal with it. Diego is obsessed with the idea of finally being a man and being able to face his father as an equal. At the Mexican consulate, Lila chooses to save Five over Diego, and this really hurts him because of his complex about being second best. But it's Lila's comment afterwards that really seems to sting. She tells him he's a man, and he needs to bloody act like it. This is a crushing blow to Diego, who still feels like a kid and is trying his best to come across as this tough, sorted adult. And a lot of kids with traumatic backgrounds feel this in adulthood, this sense of not knowing how to be a grown-up, still being a kid inside. Diego cries when he can't save Kennedy, and he cries at the table with his father. This is the same kid that did his best not to cry. We see him grimacing as he gets his tattoo as a child and pulling away from Grace when she tries to comfort him. Diego also pulls away from Klaus at the table when Klaus tries to comfort him. Both times Diego feels like a fraud and a failure, like for all his best efforts, he hasn't managed to be good enough. But as devastated as Kennedy dying and his father's words at the table make him feel, Diego doesn't sink. You can't sink him. He's stubborn in a beautiful way, because you can pile tragedy and trauma on him, and Diego will get to his feet and keep on going. Diego doesn't realise how much of a man that makes him in the healthiest ways. He's already surpassed Reginald by having so much empathy, being protective of his family, by never giving up either on a goal or on a person, and always looking to defend an underdog rather than destroy them. I'm going to get symbolic again, but in the two big scenes of Diego using his powers this season, the first apocalypse at the start of episode 1, and then the fight with the Commission in episode 10, we have Diego quite literally dodging or deflecting bullets. Every character seems to have a power that reflects their personality in some way, and it really suits Diego's stubbornness, his refusal to just lie down and die, that he uses his powers to ward off bullets and stay standing. It takes everything out of him, but Diego covers for 5. The bullets are inches from him, but he uses that last bit of energy to refuse to let them reach their target. Diego fights stubbornly, and he loves stubbornly, and that is why I love him so very, very much. Thanks for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. Just like in my Luther video, there was a lot I had to cut out for time, so any further thoughts you have on Diego are welcome in the comments. You can tip me on PayPal if you so wish. I am a student doing my creative writing MA, which will hopefully lead to me writing for shows like the amazing Umbrella Academy one day. If you ever see this, David Castaneda, you are doing God's work with your characterization. The depth Diego has is just unbelievable at this point, because we're only 2 seasons in. The next video is all about Allison, number 3, The Rumour. Be safe, and I'll see you really soon.